This is a vintage 60-plus-year-old Zenith record console that I got off of Facebook Marketplace for free. This record console has been lost to time, and I want to fix it up and give it a makeover. Let's get into it. Unfortunately, the first step to a project like this is almost always cleaning, especially with a console like this built in the 50s or 60s. There's just layers of dust and grime and dirt, as well as a very strong cigarette smell, which I hope to get out. For all the dust, I'm just going around with a dry Swiffer pad on both the inside and out, and just wiping it down. Then for some of the more delicate areas, as well as some of the harder to reach corners, I'm just spraying compressed air, just trying to be super thorough and blow as much off as I can. Then I'm just going to repeat that same process up here in the upper section of the cabinet, just making sure to get as much of the dust and grime out as I can. Now I'm going to try and get the cigarette smell out of the record cabinet. To do so, I'm just going to dampen a microfiber cloth with some diluted Dawn dish soap and water, and then just go ahead and start wiping off all the gunk and the grime and try to get the smell out. However, as you're probably noticing here, it looks like I'm just taking stain off of the console cabinet itself, which definitely isn't great. But it shouldn't be that much of a problem because, spoiler alert, I'm planning on sanding and painting over a lot of this and covering other parts up. Anyway, with the cleaning done, it's time to move on to the electronics. The electronics I need to get at should all be housed under this metal box here, specifically the electrolytic capacitors as well as the paper capacitors, as these are what tend to wear out in these old units. I found these 4 hex nuts here that looked like they're what made it come out, so I just went ahead and started unscrewing them. And pro tip, don't try using the end of wire cutters to unscrew hex bolts. It's a big pain in the ass. I should have just gone to the store and bought a wrench. And after getting them loose enough to work them out with my fingers, I finally got all 4 of these hex bolts out, and then it was time to pull the thing down. Okay, so conveniently, my camera just died right as I got the thing out, but obviously here you see it. It's actually pretty fucking heavy. I gotta find something to put this on while holding it. Okay, very temporarily I have it sitting on a fucking Swiffer box. It's hanging by the wires kind of right now, so I gotta go find something quick. And after looking around the crib a little bit, I was able to find a box for a Jenga game to stand one end up, and for the other end, I used a box to a Fortnite Giddy Up Funko Pop that I had laying around, and that ended up working well, as I now have pretty decent access to both the electrolytic and paper capacitors, all of which I'll have to replace. Editing Evan here. You're probably wondering, how do I know I even need to replace the caps and stuff in this thing? Did I even test it? And the answer to that question is yes. I use this thing called a dim bulb tester that I built a while ago. I'll put a link to how it works in the description, and here's a diagram. I don't really feel like explaining it, but basically it takes the spare voltage so it doesn't fry the electronics, and I tested with that, and it showed that there was definitely some leaky voltage. So anyway, that's how I know, and let's get back to the video. We're going to start by replacing these 2 electrolytic capacitors as you see here, mainly just because I have a bunch of spare capacitors laying around from other projects. And as you can see, it's all pretty busy down there with all the different wires connecting to the terminals. So I decided I was just going to cut close to the capacitor itself and leave the capacitor's legs and solder directly onto that, so I wouldn't have to unsolder any other stuff. And with that first capacitor removed, I just got to select the right replacement. As for selecting a replacement capacitor, it's pretty simple. There's 2 values on the capacitor, the voltage and the UF rating. You just want to make sure the UF rating is the exact same, and the voltage rating is at or greater than the capacitor's rating you're replacing. And in my case, I'm replacing a 10 UF 25 volt capacitor with a 10 UF 50 volt capacitor. And with the right replacement selected, it's time to solder. Bruh. As you can see here, we have the new one all soldered in. Now it's time to move on to the second one. Just like the first one, I used some nail clippers and got it all removed. And after taking it out and inspecting it, I noticed that it was 12 UF, which is not a very common measurement for UF, and not one I had, meaning I'd have to order one online and wait for it to ship. So in the meantime, I put a piece of painter's tape on each of the 2 terminals so I wouldn't lose them later on, and marked which was positive and which was negative. Alright, so it's been a few days since that last clip, and while the electrolytic capacitor was shipping, I realized I totally forgot to order any paper capacitors at all. I just totally blanked on the fact that I'd need those too since I'm replacing them. But yeah. It's all here. Anyway, I'm gonna get soldering. Alright, so as you can see here, we have all the capacitors replaced. In total, it was 2 electrolytic capacitors and 9 paper capacitors. Of course, the paper capacitors you replace with these little red film capacitors. They're the modern equivalent. Anyway, then it was time to reinstall the metal chassis, which was rather difficult as I was fighting against gravity, but eventually I was able to get it in, and all that was left to do was to re-plug in a couple vacuum tubes as well as a wire that had fallen out, and I was ready to dim bulb test again. Although that'll have to wait for tomorrow. Right now, I gotta go to work. Alright, so about to do the dim bulb tester. Pretty simple. We either want the bulb to light up and then drop to a steady dim, or we want it to light up and drop to nothing. That means there's not that much spare voltage leaking, and our electronic replacements were a success. With that, it was time to hook up the record player to the dim bulb circuit, hook up the dim bulb circuit to a power strip, and flip the switch. As it turns out, some wires in the dim bulb circuit had gotten loose. I fixed those up and tried again. Alright, so the dim bulb test, very promising. Everything looked like it worked as it should. While I was testing stuff, I also decided to plug in the speaker cabinet part of the record player unit, and, well, yeah, so anyway, I'm gonna have to, try and figure that out, but can't do that right now because it's nighttime and the upstairs neighbor's trying to sleep, I bet, so for now, I think I'm gonna just tackle the stuck motor. Well, stuck motor isn't exactly the right terminology. I think the motor's okay. Basically, the platter just barely spins, or sometimes doesn't spin at all when I hit the power switch, and it also has this bumpy, vibrating sound every time it crosses a certain point in its rotation, so I'm going to try and figure out why that's happening. I'm also not sure if it not turning and the sound are related, but let's go ahead and take off the platter and figure it out. Alright, so I find this very interesting, right? I think this is the rubber idler wheel, it's called. You see it kind of spins, it's pretty gunked up there. But then when you move that over, you start moving it. Look at that, the on-off switch starts moving. How does this work? So does that then spin this thing? Oh, yeah. So what actually happens when you flip this switch is mechanically you're pushing the rubber idler into the motor shaft and they spin together like gears. And above that, this little rubber wheel spins as well, and it drives the platter wheel by spinning on its inside edge. And here you see the motor shaft actually has 4 different sized points for contact with the rubber idler, because when this switch is flipped, it actually raises or lowers how high the motor sits. Each of these heights gives you a different contact point on the motor, and each contact point being a different size means you'll get a different RPM. I also notice here it has trouble switching up speeds as the rubber idler seems to get stuck. My theory is that either the rubber idler or the motor, or both, are in the incorrect positions, causing there to be too much pressure on the motor from the rubber idler, meaning it can't spin properly. And I went down rabbit hole after rabbit hole trying to figure this out. Was a hinge on either the speed selector or the rubber idler so grimy that it couldn't get itself to the right position, thus causing the pressure? Or maybe after years of not being used, the motor itself was just a little bit loose in its housing, causing it to be out of position. Maybe a spring had worn out. Maybe something was bent down below. None of these things seemed to be the issue, so I decided I was going to step away for a few hours and come back later with a fresh mind. Alright, I'm back. I'm still convinced something's mechanically wrong, so I'm going to go ahead and take off this black plate that houses the turntable platter and everything. To do that, there's just a couple C-clips I had to get off here on the bottom, and then a couple screws to take out on the top. There are certain parts of the on-off switch mechanism as well as the up and down mechanism for the speed control that are just not visible when this thing's mounted on there, so I figure maybe I can find something that I didn't see otherwise with this thing taken off. And after a long while of fidgeting later, I still wasn't any closer to figuring out what was going on with this thing. After a while longer staring at this thing, I realized that maybe I was thinking about it all wrong. I'd spent the entire time thinking something was mounted wrong or positioned wrong. I didn't even consider that the motor might just not have enough torque to get over the friction it's usually able to. My first thought was, well, let's just lube the motor up. Maybe it's just old and stuck. That didn't work. However, as I was sitting there spinning the platter with my hand, I had a thought. Safety third.
Bitch, this shit works!
Yeah, somehow I didn't think of it, but the dim bulb tester was actually pulling some of the voltage needed to fully drive the motor. But hey, at least it's a simple fix, and nothing's really broken. Now as far as the turntable itself goes, I just gotta figure out what's causing that weird vibration. Alright, so it's the next day. I woke up super eager to figure out what was causing the little vibraty sound. I figured that since it still does that even when I'm spinning the platter by hand, it can't be anything to do with the rubber idler. So I figured, okay, maybe it's just something with the inside, like the inner part where the platter sits. And I took out the bearing that sits under it, and I just put a little oil on there and fixed it right up. No more vibration, so now it's all good. And although I didn't have the second speaker set up yet, I had to throw a record on there and just see if it produced any sound. Sweet! Alright, now I gotta try and figure out why when I plug in the speaker cable it does this. That obviously shouldn't be happening. And just inspecting the cable, it's just in really poor shape. It looks like the two ends are hardly connected. However, before doing anything you can't undo, always good to just try and clean it off first and see if that fixes issues. So I used some isopropyl on both the male and female parts of the connectors. And with that, it was time to go ahead and test again. And yeah, I didn't think that would fix anything. However, this test did actually help me notice something important, that when I jangled the cable around, it actually made a lot of static noises, which usually means there's something structurally wrong with it. So, I decided it was time to rip apart the cable and see what we were working with. However, as I took this cable apart, I was actually pretty confused by what I was seeing. It looked like there was one center wire with insulation around that, and then other wire wrapped around that. I did some research, apparently this is how it's supposed to work. The inside wire that's insulated is supposed to connect to the wire coming out of this pin, and the outside wire is just supposed to connect anywhere on that metal shell. And the two wires can't be electrically connected at all because one of them is acting as the ground. As I was messing around with the inner wire and soldering and heat shrinking, disaster struck. The inner wire had snapped. Alright, so it's pretty much impossible to tell on camera, but in here there are a few little wires poking up, and those wires can't be touching any part of this base, like
the outside of the base at all, they can't touch. So I need to solder on the inside of the other wire that you saw earlier back onto this inside, but there's obviously no room to get in there with a soldering iron and have like a heat shrink tube around to insulate it. So my thinking is if I go to a store and I get some of the heat shrink seal tubes that have solder put inside of them, that I could just solder that directly in and it would insulate and connect it. So I'm gonna go to the store and see. Alright, so I went to a couple stores and I found these. They're about the right size, I think, hopefully. I'm hoping that if I just cut down by the area of solder right there, like slightly above it, it will just fasten when I try and solder it. So let's see.
And it took a while of heat shrinking, but the inner wires were electrically and physically connected, and they weren't connected to the outer shell. So now all I had to do was solder on the outer wire to the outer shell, and it was all set.
Hold on. Hey now. I think it's working.
At the very least, it wasn't making the loud hum anymore. So I guess it's just time to test with a record and see.